afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Advances in Child Maltreatment Prevention speaker series, Preventing Human Trafficking Among Youth, Leveraging Survivor Insights. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you wish to receive CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the time and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentation. You'll see the first one momentarily. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box or the chat. We do encourage participation in the chat throughout today's presentation. We'll pass things on to Dean Angel now to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beth Angel. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Work, and I'm so excited to be here with you today, and in particular to see so many of our alumni with us today. It's my honor to welcome you to the Advances in Child Maltreatment Prevention speaker series. This series was created by Professor Todd Herrenkohl, the Marion Elizabeth Blue Professor of Children and Families, and it features the work of leading prevention and child welfare scholars engaged in efforts to strengthen and reform child-serving systems. This speaker series provides a forum for new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and the helping professions that can improve the health and well-being of vulnerable children and their families. And with that, I would now like to introduce the creator of this series and today's moderator, Todd Herrenkohl. Todd's primary research interests focus on the areas of child and family well-being, child maltreatment, and the psychosocial and development underpinnings of health risk behaviors in youth and adults, substance abuse, mental and physical health outcomes of adversity, and resilience. He has also worked to raise awareness of the causes and consequences of violence in children and families, and to promote the use of public health models of primary prevention. And so with that, I will pass things over to Todd. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks so much, Beth. And thank you all for joining today. As Emma mentioned, this presentation today continues a conversation that we began with our Forey Memorial Lecture in the fall on the topic of human trafficking. So for those of you who did attend, about a third of you, I think, you may hear some common themes, some common statistics and recommendations, and all of that is intentional. We want to sort of underscore these important points about a very troubling and enduring problem. So this session today will feature two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Michelle Munro-Kramer, and I'll say a bit more about Michelle in a moment. She, in turn, will introduce our second speaker, Kwami Adoboe-Herrera. Our goal for today's session is to center evidence-based data and survivor perspectives to reduce myths and misconceptions about the topic of human trafficking and to deepen understanding of models of care for survivors. Our two speakers will talk about the types and venues for human trafficking in the United States, some of the warning signs that a victim of human trafficking might exhibit, and tools that can be used to identify victims of human trafficking within healthcare settings, all in the spirit of supporting and advancing prevention and intervention efforts. So our first speaker, Professor Munro-Kramer, is a PhD graduate of the University of Michigan, an assistant professor, the Suzanne Bellinger Feetham Professor of Nursing, and the Director of Global Programs at the University of Michigan School of Nursing. Michelle is an educator, practitioner, researcher whose work spans domestic and international contexts. In her research, Michelle is particularly interested in leveraging practitioners' creativity to develop innovative solutions to complex health and human rights challenges, including human trafficking. She applies mixed methods and participatory action research to understand the experiences of vulnerable populations, and then uses this information to inform intervention development. Dr. Munro-Kramer has published in leading nursing, healthcare, and social science journals. And in recent publications, she and her colleagues highlight the need for training in healthcare so that providers are equipped to address the complex needs of trafficking survivors. So without further delay, I'll hand this over to Michelle. And Michelle, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be joining you all this afternoon. I'm thrilled to be sharing a little bit more of about human trafficking with all of you, along with my colleague, Kwami Adoboe-Herrera. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we will go ahead and jump right in. So today I will be talking to you about preventing human trafficking among youth, leveraging survivor insights, and I will be doing this using a lot of the data out there. So I am coming from this nursing research perspective, where I will be reinforcing some of the data you may have already heard, as well as providing some more kind of clinically based information. And then my colleague will be providing a bit more of a story, talking about human trafficking from a slightly different aspect. Over the next couple of hours, there are a few questions and considerations that I would love for you to keep in mind. The first is, how can we shift our focus from secondary prevention and the need to think about identifying or rescuing or really kind of having survivors self-disclose to a focus more on primary prevention and eliminating the factors that increase vulnerability to human trafficking. The second consideration I want you to keep in the back of your head is that we often think about human trafficking as this kind of unicorn or something that we will not encounter in our professions. And when I talk to healthcare providers about this, I often start by having them just reflect on whether or not they believe they have encountered a human trafficking survivor in their work. And this is an interesting thing to reflect on, because many individuals, when spending a little time thinking about this, recognize and encounter that, something seemed a little bit off, and you can't always label it or identify it. But it might have been something that warranted a little more attention. And so I would really encourage everyone, social workers, social service providers, as well as the healthcare providers I work with, to think about how they can utilize their knowledge and skills related to other forms of gender-based violence. So things like intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, when we're thinking about the topic of human trafficking. And finally, the last consideration I want you to keep in mind is how to provide a coordinated transdisciplinary response to survivors of human trafficking. And as a nurse midwife and a family nurse practitioner, I am thrilled to be able to speak to social workers, because I believe it is so imperative that we really work together and plan ahead in how we might approach the diverse needs of trafficking survivors and really help provide resources for those needs that survivors identify as being a top priority. So a little more background on my work. I really appreciate the introduction from Dr. Herrenkohl. I really am approaching this from a clinician perspective. So I've been a registered nurse for 20 years and then a family nurse practitioner and certified nurse midwife for 17 years. And it was really my clinical practice that brought me back to get a PhD and to research different forms of gender-based violence. So encounters with patients really led me to want to try to understand decision-making factors and how individuals decide to seek care. And I also approach my work from a community-engaged perspective, or a community-engaged approach, meaning that I'm working with communities, populations, and advocates to address these different topics. The other kind of a piece I want to use to set the stage here is that human trafficking has really been identified as this wicked or complex problem. And there are current continuing education requirements really happening around the nation. And so states like the state of Michigan now identify these 4 requirements as learning objectives for a variety of different kind of health and social service providers. And it is a requirement that individuals in the state of Michigan that are providing care to others get this education before licensure renewal. And so there really is this focus on gaining a better understanding of human trafficking in the United States, being able to identify potential warning signs, thinking about screening, and then thinking about these comprehensive models of care. And so again, we are going to address some of these components that have been outlined by the state of Michigan training standards. But again, I also really want you to think about the lived experiences of human trafficking survivors and the societal, community, and systemic factors that make individuals vulnerable to this really heinous crime. So before we get started, we're going to continue utilization of that poll. And so you will see there are 5 questions on here that are true and false. I think you will have to scroll down in the poll function, but I'm going to give everybody a minute to go ahead and go through these questions, and then we will walk through each of them individually. All right, maybe like 30 seconds longer to go ahead and answer those. Great, thank you so much, Emma. So we're going to go ahead and walk through each of these individually, and I can kind of see what people were thinking as well, which is wonderful. I always start with these pre-checks as well, because there are lots of myths and misconceptions associated with human trafficking. And despite this growing awareness about human trafficking and increased focus on it from the state level, it really continues to go underreported due to its covert nature, a lot of misconceptions about its definition, and then a lack of awareness about indicators. And so as a victim advocate, as a social service provider, a mental health provider, it is important for you to be aware of these myths and really to be able to answer them and provide information about them when they come up in the clinical context, in talking to kind of patients or clients, or even when talking to friends and family. And so these are some of the most frequent kind of myths and misconceptions that I have come across in my work. The first one is that all human trafficking involves sexual abuse. And I think the majority of respondents got this one correct. This is false. Human trafficking includes both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, as well as other forms of trafficking. So things like organ trafficking and forced marriage, which we really won't spend any time on today. And so really this idea, this term human trafficking, is an umbrella with many different forms underneath it. And while sexual abuse occurs in different forms of trafficking, it is not always present in every situation. So for instance, in certain labor trafficking situations. And so when we use the term human trafficking, and it's only to refer to sex trafficking, we really make labor trafficking victims invisible. And so again, when using the phrase human trafficking, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we are describing many different forms of trafficking. And today we'll be focusing on both labor and sex trafficking. The second pre-check question was if an international border must be crossed to classify as human trafficking. And this is also false. And I think almost everybody who took the pre-test got this correct. So a victim need not be physically transported from one location to another for the crime to fall within the definition of human trafficking. And we actually see this a lot in Michigan. This means that human trafficking is happening to individuals in southeastern Michigan who have never physically moved to a new location. They've been in southeastern Michigan their entire lives. We will spend a little time reviewing the federal definition of human trafficking, and you will see that this is also a component of it. The third pre-check question was, abduction is a common feature of trafficking, especially for children. This statement is also false. So traffickers use a variety of techniques to lure potential victims, which may include exploiting vulnerabilities, which we're going to spend time on. They often use lies, psychological coercion, and threats to develop a relationship with the victim. Force may also be used to manipulate victims, though abduction is not seen as a common feature of trafficking. The trafficker then uses a variety of tactics to control an individual. So again, we're using terminology similar to other forms of gender-based violence, so something like intimate partner violence. And control tactics might include emotional abuse, isolation, confiscation of identification and money, as well as threats to continue to maintain control over an individual. I think this idea of abduction has been commonly influenced by the media. So thinking about like the movie Taken, for example, that is a central component there. Whereas in reality, it's something that's much less commonly seen. The fourth pre-check was estimates suggest that men comprise a significant proportion of trafficking victims. And the statement is true. So according to the International Labor Organization, there are approximately 21 million victims of human trafficking globally. Of these, approximately 45% of them are men and boys. We're going to spend a little more time on statistics as we work through this presentation, but it is important to recognize that men and boys are victims of human trafficking and are actually much more frequently the victims of labor trafficking, so do make up a larger percentage of labor trafficking victims. And then the final pre-check was, we know where the hotspots of human trafficking are in the United States. And I think this is one of the kind of most debated myths that I have on the pre-check here. And the statement is actually false. So despite kind of growing understanding of human trafficking, there really are still some major limitations in how we measure human trafficking. And so this has to do with really kind of a lack of tools to do that, variations in definitions at the state, federal, and international level. And so while we are doing a better job at getting data on the prevalence of human trafficking, there are still some major limitations that would make me uneasy in really providing kind of a ranking or a rank-based prevalence by location. So without these reliable prevalence estimates, I think that it really is hard to say where the hotspots are. And the more important piece here is really that human trafficking is happening everywhere. So with this in mind, we're going to spend a little more time just going over human trafficking. And I wanted to just start with the fact that eliminating trafficking has been added to the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are global goals. They're the global community has really committed to ending modern slavery among children by 2025, and really by doing this universally by 2030. And if we look at some of this data throughout the rest of the presentation, you will see that unfortunately, we're not really on target to meet these goals. So when we think about the definition of human trafficking throughout the rest of this presentation, we will be using the federal definition as outlined in the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of 2000. And human trafficking is also sometimes referred to as modern slavery. And for sex trafficking, it is referring to a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And there are some caveats with this definition that we'll spend some time on, where force, fraud, and coercion are not necessary if a minor is induced to perform a sexual act, so someone under 18 years of age. For labor trafficking, it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person through, again, the use of force, fraud, or coercion for some type of labor. So involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. If I were going to break all of these definitions down into a very simple definition, I would say simply put, human trafficking is compelled service. So it occurs when a person is compelled into service for profit. There is no one profile for human traffickers or victims. Traffickers can be strangers who exploit or manipulate the victim, or more frequently, They can be friends or family members that take advantage of a vulnerability. Traffickers might work alone. For instance, a couple may traffic a nanny, a housekeeper, a domestic servant for their own personal use. Traffickers can also be a part of a network who are engaged in other types of criminal activities. And we'll spend a little more on victims, but I think the biggest thing that puts anyone at risk for human trafficking is really a lack of knowledge about what human trafficking is. So when we think about sex trafficking in relation to a minor, we often use the term domestic minor sex trafficking. And again, this definition is really similar, right? So the harboring, recruitment, or sale of individuals under the age of 18 for the purposes of commercial sex. You'll see that the second piece of this does have the term force, fraud, or coercion. That's part of the United States kind of national definition. And again, we really don't have a great grasp on how prevalent domestic minor sex trafficking is. So when we think about why we don't have a good understanding of this, we'll talk about kind of some issues and identification. So really a lack of tools. There are some variations in definitions across state, national, and international lines. And then I think the other piece of this is that human trafficking it exploits those that are most vulnerable, and it really serves to keep these individuals hidden. And so that in and of itself makes it very difficult to capture the sheer numbers of individuals involved in human trafficking. Most of the data we have on prevalence does come from individuals who are care seeking, and so often after an experience. And so we know that they are likely underestimates of the number of people that are experiencing human trafficking. The two types of trafficking we'll be focusing on, as I already mentioned, are labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is very broad, and this can be for a minor as well as an adult. It can really span different industries. I think the important thing with both labor and sex trafficking is that they are filling gaps for supply and demand. So there are a demand for cheap services, including commercial sex services, and traffickers are essentially creating supply for that demand. With labor trafficking, we often find that the type of labor can vary by region, depending on what kind of the major industries are in that region. I have done some work in northern Ethiopia related to human trafficking, and a number of individuals are trafficked to the Middle East because of the close proximity for domestic servitude. So they are promised opportunities of education, money that they can bring home to their family, and then they are compelled into service and exploited. In Southeast Asia, we see a lot of industrial fishing trafficking. And then in Michigan, we see more frequently agriculture and construction and landscaping. Sex trafficking can also occur in a variety of venues. So it can be physical locations such as, truck stops or massage parlors, or it can be online venues. And despite attempts to really kind of shut down some of those online venues, new online venues continue to appear. And so just to spend one last little bit of time kind of reinforcing these definitions of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, when we look at the federal law and what is required to demonstrate that sex trafficking or labor trafficking has occurred, a lawyer will be required to demonstrate that there was a process, a means, and an end related to the trafficking. So for sex trafficking, as we saw in the definition earlier, this could be recruiting someone, harboring, moving them, obtaining them by force, fraud, or coercion for a commercial sex act. There are a couple pieces that I want to point out on this slide. And so the first are these terms patronizing or soliciting. Those have actually been recently added. And so for the purpose of sex trafficking, this means that individuals who purchase commercial sex can actually be prosecuted as participating in sex trafficking. The second piece here is that no force, fraud, or coercion is required when a child is induced to perform a commercial sex act. And overall, this seems pretty straightforward, right? If someone is a minor, if they're under the age of 18, if they are involved in a commercial sex act, then they are considered a victim. However, in reality, this can become a little bit of a gray zone. And this is really an area where my colleagues at the law school spend much more time than me. So I'm not going to dive into it too much, but I do think it's a really important point to be aware of. And essentially what this means is that for instance, in the state of Michigan, the age of consent is 16. And so 16 and 17-year-olds, while minors, do have the ability to consent to sex. And for this reason, they kind of fall in this gray zone. Many states have what is called a Safe Harbor Act to protect them, to presume they are victims unless proven otherwise. And that is the case in the state of Michigan as well, and actually in many other states. So I know you may be joining from other states as well. However, this can be overcome by a prosecutor if someone fails to comply with court orders. And so I want you to realize that for sex trafficking, for minors, they are almost always thought of as a victim. However, there is there can be this presumption of innocence can be overturned in some cases, and that has happened in the past. For labor trafficking, there are no differences in the federal definition or kind of the legal process when demonstrating that labor trafficking has occurred for youth or adults, or for minors or adults. So again, we have these processes, this recruiting, harboring, moving, or obtaining of a person, again, by force, fraud, or coercion, for different forms of labor. You will notice that in that process box, movement is not a requirement, right? And soliciting and patronizing are also not there. So what this means is that we can't prosecute somebody when they purchase goods or services that are linked to human trafficking. And I think this is really important because when we think about human trafficking, I think we always kind of think of it as something that's happening around us, right? Not something that we may be involved in, but in reality, we purchase services and goods that could have been produced by somebody that was trafficked. And so, we don't necessarily knowingly do so as someone who is involved in sex trafficking and purchasing commercial sex might. But it is an important element to think about in the prevention side of things. And so a lot of our focus in social service, in healthcare, has really focused on these secondary prevention or these responses after someone has been identified as a victim or a survivor of human trafficking. But again, as I challenged you at the beginning, I want us to think about what we can do to really kind of prevent this in the first place. So as we continue moving forward, we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about trafficking vulnerabilities. Really, anyone can become a victim of human trafficking. So most traffickers do have a relationship with the victim, and they use this relationship to exploit pre-existing vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities may be individual characteristics of the person. So they might have recently migrated or relocated. They may be a sexual or gender minority youth. They may have unstable housing, or they could have actually kind of run away from home, or they may have a substance use disorder. They could be at the relationship level. So a history of abuse or neglect. We know that involvement with the foster care or child protective services also serves as a risk or a vulnerability for many youth. And then at the community level, There could be community level violence or limited educational or economic opportunities. This could be something happening in the United States. It's also something we see happening globally as well. But as I mentioned previously, one of the things that we see is the most important vulnerability is a lack of awareness about human trafficking. And so to me, these vulnerabilities help illustrate that we need to really kind of think about reframing our mindset. So when we think about a public health approach, we're currently, as I mentioned, focused on that secondary prevention response without addressing the root causes that continue to perpetuate countries, economies, and societies that demand cheap labor, in which we are willing to exploit our fellow humans to really kind of balance that supply. So what I would encourage us to think about, is all of the responses at once, right? Secondary prevention can be useful. Although I would argue that we don't necessarily need to identify someone in order to be able to provide them resources and support. But we also have to think about interventions before someone is compelled into service. So can we provide education on healthy relationships, start talking about exploitation, and really defining human trafficking for our youth, as well as thinking about the more long-term response focused on rehabilitation. So things like long-term counseling or peer support groups. And in fact, one of the things I have heard most frequently from survivors is often not even related necessarily to their health. So as a healthcare provider or a social service provider, we often think about physical health and mental health as these really important elements to address immediately. But many trafficking survivors are thinking about job skills, housing, safety first. And so really thinking about how we can prioritize their needs with this multiphasic response. So focusing on primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So we're going to take a look at how many individuals are experiencing trafficking. And there's actually some really new data available that I think has come out since the last lecture in the fall of 2022. As I mentioned, this data is kind of the best we have, but there are limitations related to this varying definitions, a lack of standardized scales or assessment tools, and difficulty in capturing a vulnerable and often hidden population. The United States State Department puts out a trafficking in persons report. And this relies on data from the International Labor Organization. And so this data just came out in the fall of 2022. It was put out by the International Labor Organization, the Walk Free Foundation, and the International Office of Migration. And so this data indicated that in 2021, there were 49.6 million people were victims of forced labor. This included approximately 22 million individuals in forced marriages and 27.6 million people trapped in forced labor. When you translate this out, this is about 3.5 people per every 1,000 person worldwide. They are victims of forced labor in which they are trapped in jobs, which may include sex work, which they were coerced or deceived into, and which they cannot leave. Of those 27.6 million people in forced labor, about 17 million are exploited in the private sector. 6 are forced into work in the commercial sexual exploitation. And then about 4 million are in forced labor imposed by the state. Again, of all of these individuals experiencing forced labor, about 12% are children. So more than half of these children are being exploited in commercial sexual exploitation. The other interesting data that was provided with this report was really looking at the regions. So when we look at the sheer number of people, we will see that Asia in the Pacific region has the highest number of people in forced labor at 15.1 million. But when you look at prevalence, so based on the population of the countries, the highest prevalence is actually the Arab states at 5.3 per 1,000 people. The other thing we can see is, again, that trafficking is happening across the world. So it really does not discriminate and affects every age, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and ethnicity. Along with the global data, we also have new data in the United States. And this data comes from Polaris, which is an organization that is fighting to eradicate human trafficking. They also operate the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And this is both a telephone line and text service that provides information, resources, as well as police reports regarding human trafficking. I do want to highlight that anybody can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline or text the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can contact them for information about resources in your area, to learn more about trafficking. If there's a potential concern you have, they really do provide a plethora of services. And in my belief, they are the ones that keep most up to date with current resources in each kind of geographical region. So their data from 2021, the following key points emerged. And so this was the first kind of data we had after COVID. So I think before this, the data had been from 2019. So it really had been a couple of years since they had been able to kind of collect and accumulate data. And what they found with this data is that the top forms of force, fraud, and coercion being used in the United States are emotional abuse, economic abuse, threats, isolation, and withholding needs. They also found that recruiters or traffickers are often known to the victim survivor and that they are exploiting a personal relationship. And they saw a dramatic increase in online recruitment, as well as both family and partner recruitment during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's a few reasons for this. And so we will talk a little more about COVID and what I think it's taught us about gender-based violence more broadly, but also about human trafficking and human trafficking having to do with youth more specifically. So as we think about human trafficking, it's also important to really think about these profound short and long-term health, economic, and social consequences. And I just will note that the next slide does include some data on the trauma that survivors and victims experience that can be rather upsetting. So many cases of human trafficking may only include psychological coercion. However, violent victimizations can occur. And some data that we have that is actually a little dated demonstrates that very high rates of trafficking survivors are experiencing physical assault, sexual assault, injuries, sometimes lasting physical injuries from their trafficking experience, as well as an inability to move around with any freedom. And so because of these traumas, both the physical and mental trauma, there is a recognition that many human trafficking survivors will interface with different systems, including healthcare systems and social service systems. And some of the statistics I find most staggering are related to some research done in the healthcare system. And so when we look at a couple of studies that have been done in the healthcare system, we find that anywhere between 68 and 88% of human trafficking survivors, this is in the United States, have come in contact with a healthcare provider during their trafficking and were not recognized. There are some limitations to these studies, so they were relatively small sample sizes, but I think they just reinforce how prevalent human trafficking is and how we need everybody to kind of be aware of what is happening. And so for the 68%, these were US-based trafficking survivors that came into contact with any type of healthcare provider during their trafficking experience. And then the 88% were actually domestic sex trafficking survivors. So this did include predominantly adults. However, some of the adults were reflecting on their experience as a domestic minor sex trafficking victim as well. And so to me, these statistics do reinforce the need to be aware of this, both in the healthcare system, as well as really, again, think about prevention. For the healthcare system, when we think about this, or really any system, victims, we're really relying on them to self-report, right? So we do not have good tools for identifying survivors of human trafficking. And there are many reasons that an individual might be fearful to report. They may have a relationship with a trafficker. They may fear arrest or deportation. They may feel that they have nowhere to go. So they may lack shelter, money. There might be shame or guilt. They might not identify as a victim. And to me, this really resonates as someone who also studies intimate partner violence and sexual violence. There are many individuals that don't identify with the labels or definitions that we might place on them. They also might have an unclear understanding of services available to them. I think from a system level, there really has been a lack of education about human trafficking. Many times we're unsure of what to do after someone has been identified or asks for resources. And this becomes something that takes a lot of time. And so many of our systems and services are focused on a rather fast-paced environment. And it can be a bit overwhelming. I guess speaking from a healthcare perspective, if somebody comes in for a 15-minute visit and you identify someone as a trafficking survivor, and you have to think about the resources and services that they might need. And so this is really where this coordinated transdisciplinary collaboration is necessary, right? This could be something that's identified by one individual that really does need a social worker to help support this individual in the long term and thinking about their immediate resources as well as long-term resources. I've mentioned screening a couple of times, so I did just want to spend a little time going over the current kind of state of the science in regard to screening. So as we've just demonstrated, we know that human trafficking victims and survivors are interacting with different systems. And so it's really important for us to be able to think about how we might be identifying them in these systems, while also recognizing that there are limitations to evidence-based screening tools. We know that survivors might seek services in a variety of different settings, so I've listed just a few here. And when we think about seeking services, if we go back to this idea that human trafficking victims are providing services or a supply for a demand, then their traffickers really have a vested interest in keeping them healthy, right? And so we might interact with them in a health department. I work at the Washtenaw County Health Department, and I know this is something that we have talked about. It might be in a pharmacy, it might be in a dental office, it could be for mental health services. There's a variety of different kind of settings and reasons that a human trafficking survivor might interface with the healthcare or social service system. When we think about validated screening tools, there's currently no general validated screening tool for the healthcare setting. And that means we have a few tools that have been validated for certain populations. So there is a validated tool in the healthcare setting for homeless youth, but there's nothing that could be used for adults or even youth more generally. The Vera Institute has created a tool called the Trafficking Victim Identification Tool, or TVIT. There is a short form and a long form. This has been validated for use in social service agencies, but does require training in order to administer the tool. And so one of the most useful kind of tools I have found is something called the PAIR tool, which really is more of a framework for a trauma-informed assessment of human trafficking. This was developed by the Dignity Health Center, and it's pretty straightforward, right? Step one is providing privacy. So thinking about discussing sensitive topics alone and in a safe private setting. Sometimes this can be a little difficult to establish. So thinking about how to get an individual alone, whether you are in person with them or online, and ensuring they are safe is very important. Step two would be educating. So talking to the patient about why we ask questions, noting the relationship between human trafficking and different health and social service needs. Step three would be asking questions related to human trafficking. And then step four would be respecting and responding. So again, recognizing that if a patient denies victimization or declines assistance, then we need to respect their wishes. And it's important for us to then think about providing resources and a safe space for support. This would definitely differ if you are working with a minor versus an adult. If you are working with a minor, then human trafficking is something that would be reported as any other form of child maltreatment. But if you are working with a mentally competent adult, then human trafficking in and of itself is not something that is an automatic report. It's something that should be reported in collaboration with the victim or survivor when they feel ready to report that and if they feel it is safe to report. There's been a lot of recent work specifically looking at screening for human trafficking among minors. There's been a couple of different reviews recently. And what they have actually found is that a lot of times we're attempting to focus on both adults and children at the same time without really taking into consideration these unique developmental time periods that might influence both the types of questions we ask, the language we use, but also are really the legal understanding of human trafficking and how that varies, for instance, for sex trafficking among a minor versus adult. They're often not comprehensive, so they focus only on predominantly sex trafficking, not on both sex and labor trafficking. And then none have been developed for our younger youth. So none have really been developed for individuals younger than 10 years old. So I've talked a bit about some of the challenges, right? So where we're at as far as the state of the science related to human trafficking. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about these challenges, but also really thinking about the opportunities. So one of the things that our research group did is we looked at the state of Michigan, and we really wanted to understand how we are both screening and responding to a variety of forms of gender-based violence. So we were looking at intimate partner violence, child maltreatment, as well as human trafficking. Our goal was to look at different types of health facilities. So we looked at federally qualified health centers, health departments, and hospitals. And we wanted to look at various regions across the state of Michigan. And so there are these pre-identified prosperity regions. There's 10 of them in the state of Michigan, and we utilize these. We sent the survey to 120 different sites. We got 42 respondents, which included 43 unique sites. There was a health department that kind of spanned a couple of different regions. So we received responses from all of the different types of facilities, including the health departments, federally qualified health centers, and hospitals. And we also received responses from all prosperity regions. However, we did receive a higher response rate from the Detroit metropolitan region. And what our data demonstrated is that most health facilities had screening policies related to child maltreatment and intimate partner violence. And they also had response protocols, more frequently actually had response protocols. And so this, when we think about this makes sense, right? There are legal protections in place for reporting and responding to child maltreatment that really have likely driven the need for these institutional policies and protocols. For intimate partner violence, there have been a variety of national policies and funding to support universal screening. So things like the Affordable Care Act. There's also a variety of guidance from different groups like the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, that really have contributed to a greater understanding of screening and response. But when we look at human trafficking, we really saw some areas that were lacking. And so, unfortunately, we did not see very many places that had screening policies for human trafficking, only 39%. And then about 62.5% had some sort of response protocol. Overwhelmingly, these were more likely to focus on sex trafficking than they were labor trafficking. And even when they did exist, there were some significant kind of barriers to them. And so they often included links or resources for individuals that were no longer in existence. So they'd kind of send them out to a link that was a web page that unfortunately no longer existed. And so what we heard from our participants is that this public health approach to human trafficking is really lacking. And they really wanted they believe that in general, we needed to think about how to address human trafficking from the individual level. So thinking about, in this study, we were working with healthcare providers, but I think this could also translate to social service providers and the training that is needed. This is not a standard part of curriculum in any healthcare environment. So for nurses or physicians that I'm aware of, it's not something that's part of our testing for certification. And so it's just something now that we're starting to focus on a bit more. At the health facility level, they wanted to see more of a focus on policies and response procedures. And so they actually wanted to see examples. And I think here we can really rest in what already exists. What are the policies and procedures for child maltreatment? We can often kind of replicate and utilize those pre-existing policies for human trafficking with some minor tweaks and information. At the community level, they wanted to think about multidisciplinary responses. And so they recognized that they often weren't aware of resources that were available in the community and that they needed to identify those resources before coming across a potential victim or survivor and think about how to work together to provide services. So again, really thinking about those warm handoffs and already having those relationships so that individuals can get the services that they need. And then at the societal level, doing this, so thinking about increased public awareness and then funding so that we do have a better understanding of both human trafficking, including things like the prevalence and data. I'm going to end just by following up again on thinking about some of these amplified risks and impacts related to COVID-19. So I mentioned that our data demonstrated an increase in trafficking by family members and partners. And with COVID-19, it really has kind of illuminated what's happening in some homes, right? And so we did see a documented increase in intimate partner violence and child maltreatment. We know that family violence is a risk factor for human trafficking. We increased the use of the internet by children. This was often for education, for kind of social reasons. Many children were using the internet at a much higher rate, and predators were connecting with and then exploiting youth. They were taking advantage of this. Economic strains were seen both nationally and internationally. This led to increased cross-border migration, as well as associated labor exploitation and trafficking. And then some of these economic stresses also led to increased exploitation of children. There are documented cases of this, as well as homelessness, which is another risk factor for trafficking. Despite all of this, we were limited in our ability to provide supports. So it was more difficult to identify those in trafficking situations because of the increased stress and strain on healthcare systems, educational systems, and social service systems. And we had some more difficulty in providing these services. So that multidisciplinary approach was a little harder to achieve, and many of our social services were overwhelmed. I do not believe this is the last time we'll have some sort of pandemic that affects individuals around the globe. And so really important to be thinking about how we can mitigate some of these factors in the future. So as I'm winding up here, I want us to really think about how we leverage survivor insights, because I believe that in our work related to gender-based violence, sometimes we are failing to take into consideration what survivors want most. Many times in healthcare and social services, we focus on our jobs, which is identifying the problem and providing resources or treatment. However, with human trafficking and other forms of gender-based violence, identification is not always necessary. We can still think about addressing the underlying factors, so thinking about things like poverty, housing insecurity, lack of education, even how we talk about relationships and define some of these different forms of violence without the need for a survivor or victim to self-disclose. So as we end, I would just ask you to think about our focus on identification instead of resource allocation and support. This often coincides with much of the media coverage focused on rescuing individuals. And we really need to think about making these system changes that identify and provide resources for the services most important to survivors. So as I wind up my content, I would like you to take a minute to think about some of the points of this talk today, some of the questions I've challenged you to consider. And I want you to think about big questions. So this is not a poll. This is something that you could reflect on in the chat if you're willing to share. But how will you change your practice or personal behavior to consider the primary prevention of human trafficking? And what will you do to educate someone else? So a youth, colleague, family member, or friend about human trafficking. And I'm going to go ahead and just leave this up for a couple of minutes as people ponder these questions. And I'll take a peek at the chat and just see if there's anything that needs to be addressed here before we move forward. Great. Thank you for those of you that have started to share a little bit in the chat. I did see one question in the chat that I think I'm going to go ahead and answer as people are kind of going through this self-reflection process. So there's a question by Chelsea that said, what are the signs, for example, in the clinic setting that would raise concern that someone is being trafficked? And that's a great question, Chelsea. There are a variety of kind of signs that would, I say, that are kind of red flags, right? That might alert us to something being wrong. So more general, those could be individuals that are accompanied by someone else that's doing a lot of the talking, that they're kind of looking to answer questions. Definitely needing to be careful if we have a patient or client that requires an interpreter, and making sure we're using a adequate interpreter and that we're not relying on a friend or family member that might be accompanying them. Sometimes people will be kind of unaware of place or time, or even verbalize receiving kind of care or services at a variety of different settings. For labor trafficking, the physical signs really vary depending on the type of labor, but we might see things like dehydration, just lack of sleep, sometimes different like skin infections depending on potential exposures. Sex trafficking, we would see increased kind of injuries and infections to the reproductive tract. And then for the mental health, it can be very broad, right? It can be things like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think in general, it's more putting everything together. So both kind of the signs you're seeing, what you're hearing from your patient or client, and then also relying on your feeling. Like if you get that kind of I always say it's trusting your gut, right? If you have that feeling that something feels a little off, how can you provide some resources or support to that individual in case they are experiencing compelled service or exploitation? All right, I am seeing some terrific answers in the chat. I will go ahead and spend a little more time looking through those to see if there's any more questions that we need to address after you hear from my colleague. I'm going to go ahead and put my email up here. And I wanted to let you know that I work with an excellent group of human trafficking survivors, individuals at the law school, and we have put together a website to try to provide more information on this topic. And you can find that at humantrafficking.umich.edu. It's a great resource for after this talk if you have additional questions or want to learn a little more. And then on our website, and I'm also happy to share this again, are some national resources and international resources related to human trafficking. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce my colleague. I have the pleasure of introducing a really amazing colleague and speaker who is going to share some more personal insights about human trafficking. Kwami Adoboe-Herrera is a speaker, consultant, and anti-trafficking advocate. As a survivor, he understands the tragic impact of human trafficking all around us. His lived experience shaped his career and interests, which led him to advocate for policies that assist victims as they navigate life after being trafficked. Break the Chain was a documentary that featured Kwami. The film shows how human trafficking goes unnoticed in our own backyards. Break the Chain was created to provide a reliable and educational entertainment resource for use in training and community awareness events across the United States. Kwami is currently a board member of Not for Sale, One Step at a Time. This is an organization that raises awareness and provides hope to communities throughout Ohio, America, and the world. President Trump appointed Kwami to the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking in December of 2020. The Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act was enacted on May 29th, 2015, and this established the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which provides a formal platform for trafficking survivors to advise and make recommendations on federal anti-trafficking policies to the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. Kwami also partners with the Blue Campaign, the federal government, and other non-governmental organizations to raise awareness about human trafficking, and he works with these organizations as a consultant. Overall, his goals are to raise awareness, to reduce the risk of victimization, to educate members of the government and the general public, and to advocate for victim protection and wellness. Kwami earned a Bachelor of Science in Education from Walsh University, and his ultimate goal is to work for the federal government assisting victims of human trafficking. So I would like to stop sharing and welcome Kwami.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Again, thank you I'm a Michigander. I just want to put it out there. I grew up in Ypsilanti, Michigan. So it's always it's a wonderful time when I can do seminars like this and involving my fellow Michiganders. So with further ado, I just want to say that I'm very honored to be here today and to share with you guys some of my experience that I had when it comes to service providers and healthcare and how that played a role in my life during my time I was with my trafficker, and after I was out of my trafficker's house, how all those play a role in my life to this day. So thank you for all being here. I'm going to dive right into it. I was born to this country when I was a minor. I was roughly somewhere between 7 and 12. I resigned in Michigan, Ypsilanti, Michigan. For all my life, that's where I spent most of my life at. 6 years of my life was spent there with my trafficker and the 3 other family members that came here on a process called asylum. So it's a visa that you can apply for that will then transfer you into the US if somebody already living here. So my trafficker was already living here, so he was able to apply for the visa and he got approved, and he brought me and a couple other kids who we're not really families. He just brought us here on a false promise. As Michelle said earlier, that's one of the signs of trafficking is that false promises is part of it. And so I wasn't aware of that until recently. That's what was happening. I was being trafficked. So it's a process that I'm still learning. I'm still trying to understand what human trafficking itself is as a whole, because it is constantly changing and is such hidden process, hidden evil that is among us, happening everywhere. So I'm still learning. But all I have to say is that service providers and healthcare providers, they have played a huge role in my life when I was my trafficker. Why? Because they didn't really help me. I spent some time in the hospital. Nobody seemed to know what was going on. As a minor, it's really hard to, it's the rules, against minor just be in a room with a doctor or a nurse or whatever. So my trafficker is always with me every time I attend any doctor's appointment, cleaning my teeth or checkup. And also we don't visit the same hospital every time. So it is really hard for any doctors or anyone to really pick up a sign that, oh, hey, you broke your arm yesterday and you came to the hospital. Oh, what happened? Well, first of all, I cannot answer that question. And secondly, my trafficker was there. And third, is a language barrier. So as you can see, there's a lot of things that are playing a role that is hard for any provider to identify me as potential victim or someone who's already been being trafficked already. So I did attend a hospital, U of M, a lot, but I don't always go to the same location of that are there. I always jump around the Ann Arbor area trying to figure it out, because my trafficker was really good. He actually worked in U of M. He was a custodian in the U of M, so he was really good. He knows the system very well. He knows where all the doctors are. He knows where everything's at in the U of M area. So he was able to take us to all the checkup or cleanings for teeth or whatever that is that he needs to do. We needed. He was able to do them where that nobody to, identify who we are. So again, my trafficker had everything controlled from the moment I wake up until I go to bed. So everything I eat or drink, he knows that. He knows my everyday movements. There were days that we went to a hospital where I remember vividly one day I was at a dentist one day as a 7 years old, all my teeth already in, like you can see my adult teeth already. The dentist noticed that, but he didn't really put two and two together. Like, how can you be younger than your teeth? Again, I'm not blaming some of these people only because they don't know what they don't know. So moving forward, this is the kind of things we do right now. Be able to do this kind of seminars and these trainings help us to understand, like, okay, we need to build reports. We need to have a moment where we are not just focused on what we are doing, but we're also serving that person as a whole. Because if that doctor would take a moment to ask me a question, he will know that my age does not match my teeth. And then he also noticed that my tooth was, half missing. Half my tooth was missing in my mouth. Like I have cracked teeth, And so, he didn't really care about those things. So he just did his job and move on. And that was it. Again, I'm not saying anything mean about these people. I'm just saying this is what happened to me on the times I was with my trafficker. Looking back at it, I wish they helped me, but they didn't. And also when I was in the school system, DHS was horrible to me. They didn't seem to care, you know. They said DHS, you know, they are supposed to provide help for me. They are the background, they're a government employee who was supposed to protect children, and yet they were one of the worst protecting me. When I told them my story, like what was going on in my household, how my trafficker was treating me, they didn't seem to care. They thought it was, I'm just lying. Why? Because I don't think they were trained in the system. They were not trained to see the signs of human trafficking, because they are used to, you know, what we call it, abuse situation, which this is also an abuse as well. I was abused. I was being beaten. I was starved. I was malnourished. I didn't have all these things. All the signs are there, but they didn't understand what human trafficking was, what labor traffic was. Because that's what happened to me. I was doing labor for my trafficker, domestic labor for him throughout the Michigan area. He has friends in Michigan, you know, in Detroit, Livonia, all over. I was cleaning for him. I was doing whatever he asked me to do. I was providing service for him. In return, I got nothing. I got zero. If I don't do it properly, I'm getting beaten all the time. You know, I wear glasses to this day because of that. My left eye has scar on it there because he beat me to the point where I couldn't see out of my left eye. I wasn't able to go to hospital because he knows if I do, people ask questions. So I stayed. He had me stay at home the whole time until my scar was my wound was healed, and I still couldn't see. It was until I left my trafficker. That's why I was able to get glasses to correct my eyes, but to that point it was too late. So I wear glasses to this day. Well, yeah, so I was talking with DHS. DHS, you know, when it comes to Child Protect Services, when I told them what was going on in the house, they didn't listen to me in a way that they didn't trust what I was telling them. And when I revealed to them, hey, this is what's happening, do not go talk to my trafficker, they instead went behind my back to investigate what was going on in the house. When I already told them, don't do that, that is a mistake, don't do that, like, listen to me, take a moment, just listen to me. They didn't listen, and they did that. And for the next 2 weeks of my life, I was stuck in my house with my trafficker, where he just beat the crap out of all 4 of us for 2 weeks. Again, we need to do a better job in training others on this kind of signs, what labor traffic look like, what human traffic looks like. You know, this happened to me back in 2000, from 2006 until 2013. That's like, that was those moments, those times. I don't know what the laws was, you know, how we train, you know, what we were doing during those times to like support our service providers or our doctors or healthcare providers, but it was nothing there. There was a lack of data, it was lack of understanding, lack of education. So nobody really seemed to know what was going on. Nobody seemed to want to investigate. But now I do know we are doing a lot better job. I've seen signs and doing ways to help those who are in this situation or are coming out of a situation that need help. So me being where I am today wasn't because of the healthcare providers. It was because of the teacher who saw that I was being malnourished, saw that I was being abused at home. She was able to step in to help me while she put her life in the line for me to help me out. So we got a long way to go. We got a long way to go. This is not over yet. This fight is not over yet. We're still fighting this fight. That's why I'm able to be where I am today, because I'm given ability to speak about it, to share my experience so I can help others understand, like, we need to do more work. We have a lot of work to do to protect those who are being trafficked, those who are already exiting the traffic situation. We need to also protect them, have housing for them, have a place for them to stay. Michelle was talking about something earlier. Oftentimes, those who are foreigners, one of the biggest issues, they don't want to be deported. Again, why? Because the trafficker has brainwashed them to not trust public figure authorities. And so in my head, also, I don't want to talk to doctors. I don't want to talk to anybody because I don't trust them. I don't want them to know what is happening in my household. So, and also I don't want to be deported. So you have to know there's so much is playing a role. The psychological torture that traffickers use, it is so detrimental. Like I have PTSD to this day because of that. There's days in my life I was just, I have my own family and I have 2 kids, but still, there's days I wake up just so scared that I'm with my trafficker again. I know I'm in a safe place, but still, is that PTSD that is in me still, like that mental, physical, that mental pain that he has put into my life has still plays a role in my life to this day. So the physical part of that, that psychological torture doesn't go away. It's something that I'm gonna have for the rest of my life. And I try to work through it when I was in Michigan. I attended counseling. The counselor didn't really help me. Instead, they were just exploiting me. They were just re-victimizing me. And they were traumatizing me back all over again. So I stopped going to counseling because of that reason. And we shouldn't be doing that. That's not how we should be treating that person who just come out of that situation. We should love them and see them for who they are instead of victimizing them. I hope to go back to counseling someday, but right now I just don't feel like going because I just don't trust the system that well to go back to counseling. So as I'm talking to you guys about this is kind of issue that just about every trafficker, any victim or survivor deals with. And the more I talk to them, they all deal with this, especially those who are foreigners or from different countries, have language barriers. They struggle to find service anywhere. To find housing, to find any kind of service there is that to help them navigate back into society. It's hard for them to find that service because no one is willing to help them out. And that's not okay. We need to do a better job helping survivors back to society. They have the courage. All we need is to help them out to back to society, instead of figuring out our checklist. I get it. We have work to do. We have paperwork checklist. We have to always check. But at the same time, we need to take a step back and to see that person for who they are. And that's my main point. I want to stress is that please just listen to us and see us for who we are. Okay, not for our trauma, not for our pain. See us as a humans. We are whole. See us that way, and then trying to help us get back on our feet. Don't hand us whatever we are looking for. Help us get there. That is the goal. And I was never given that when I was in Michigan. When I was out of my trafficker's house, I was never given any kind of service. The ones I was given, they were terrible. They actually made my life worse. So I stopped. And that shouldn't be like that. We need to do a better job. Okay, we need to do a better job when it comes to protecting the victims who are experiencing trafficking, not just in Michigan, but across the country, across the US. It's a problem that we are seeing, that I've seen. I've talked to a lot of victims, survivors. They deal with the same thing. How they have been treated is horrible, especially in the healthcare system. It's horrible how they have been treated. And so we got to do a better job. And Michelle was talking about a website that I helped actually. We work together. She's an awesome colleague. I enjoy working with her. So to check out that website, there's a good tools on there of how to see signs of trafficking. It's amazing work that she put together. So I recommend you to go to that website to check it out. But that's where I will stop. If you have any question, please direct it to us, and we'll be happy to answer this question for you. Currently I live in Ohio, but I'm always going to be Michigander, no matter what. That's where I grew up at. That's where most of my life was. That's where I spent most of my life at. So I'll always be Michigander. So thank you for having me. And I hope you guys learned something from today's seminar. So you can take it back to your places of work and you realize that, and implement some stuff to how you can use it to help survivors of human trafficking across the board. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Kwami. And Michelle, thank you as well for all of the information that you provided. Why don't we go ahead and we'll start to take some questions. I'll look at Emma has been collecting the questions from the chat and the Q&A box. Why don't I just start, if I could, with a question, Michelle, for you, just kind of circling back to where you started. You said something in the beginning that I think maybe we need to underscore a bit more, that the connection between trafficking, child maltreatment, intimate partner violence, all of these other kinds of things that we know to sort of co-occur. Could you say a little bit more about that dynamic and what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think there is kind of an interrelationship here. So child maltreatment, intimate partner violence can definitely be vulnerabilities or precursors to human trafficking, and then can also be part of the trafficking experience. There's a diagram I've seen before that I really like that shows it labels it pre-trafficking, but it lists all of the vulnerabilities, which can include some of these other forms of violence, like, childhood trauma or maltreatment, experiencing intimate partner violence, or witnessing, intimate partner or family violence. Then it shows some of the trauma experienced during human trafficking. So during that exploitation, some of the physical, sexual, and mental trauma that can be experienced. And then I think, as Kwami eloquently said, and thank you so much, Kwami, for sharing your story, that trauma doesn't just end, right? And so some of the results of that really lifetime of trauma continue even after somebody has kind of left or exited that trafficking situation, and in all honesty, it may make them more vulnerable to other predators in the future as well. So really is kind of like a cyclical relationship.
Great, that makes good sense. And let me, I know that a number of other people have asked this question in different forms, so I'll say it, and Kwami, you should feel free to respond to this as well. This dynamic that I think, Kwami, you raised our concern about around, the presentation a trafficker or somebody being trafficked presents in a healthcare setting, let's say, with the trafficker, and the complexity that raises with respect to assessment and really understanding, trying to sort of understand what the person is experiencing. I don't know, Michelle, maybe you could start us, and Kwami, you could kind of jump in here too. Are there things that practitioners really need to be thinking about with respect to that dynamic and how to avoid being in a situation where you really can't ask questions because of the trafficker being present?
I can start with this. So I worked in a setting where Kwami was actually seen and not identified. And that setting did some kind of introspection and debriefing to really try to understand what happened. And I've had colleagues in similar settings. Actually, a colleague at the Ozone House had a kind of a similar situation where there was an encounter with somebody, in and of itself, that for the healthcare provider, there might have been a little red flag, but not something that they felt needed to be followed up on that moment. And then later, there's a conversation with another part of the team. So for my colleague at the Ozone House, this did actually happen to be with the social worker who had kind of a separate encounter with the same patient or client. And when they talked and put together the information that both of them had learned, like immediate red flags for trafficking, right? But the pieces of information they had gotten separately didn't quite come together in the same way. And so when we've kind of did the same process in another setting, we found it was actually the person at the front desk who was sometimes seeing some really interesting dynamics or concerning dynamics between the trafficker and the individual experiencing kind of exploitation or compelled service that weren't always visible to the healthcare provider in the exam room. So for me, it's really this team approach. Like we can't do everything on our own, and recognizing that we don't see everything on our own. And there's just really a need to put all of this information together. So the health department has actually put into place kind of a way to share this information, more kind of along, I guess, the pathway that the patient follows, and then really take the time to discuss that before that person leaves the healthcare environment. But to me, that's one of our big failures, is that sometimes we are seeing little bits of information, but we don't know what to do with it, and it doesn't give us the full story. And I don't know if you'd have anything to add there, Kwami.
No, you touch upon everything that I can think of, I think, like you said, like that first front desk, like there's a lot that's happening there before you enter that, in the closed door, doing your physician, it's a lot that can be done while you are waiting there. The interaction between the victim and the trafficker, the dynamic there, if you can just see that, if you take a moment, you see that sometimes it's not really that well. So just taking that moment to work as a team, that's exactly what I'm saying, that we need to work as a team to start to identify this a lot early on. If you see the signs, start to speak up a lot early on so that we can quickly put an end to that.
I see that somebody added something in the chat here about noting in the emergency department, sometimes if there's a concern, they'll do a CT scan, a CAT scan, often fake, to get the person alone. Yes, lots of tricks like that. I mean, we barely urine specimens anymore, but I'm always walking someone to the bathroom and shutting the door so I can have that private conversation. So using different tricks like that to kind of delay even the departure of a patient or client and their trafficker, so that you can have some more time to put all of the information together, is really important. Thank you for sharing that, Hillary.
And Michelle, are there situations where the trafficker can become aware of those kinds of tactics and try to intervene?
I think I haven't heard quite as much about intervening, but more not seeking care there again. Right. And so trying to exit that, because they don't necessarily want to make a scene, but kind of exiting the situation as quickly as possible and then not seeking the care there again. And I think that's one of the tricky parts here, right, is there is usually a concerted effort to not continue to seek care in the same place. So to not allow those trusting relationships to kind of build, to not allow, healthcare providers or social service providers to put together those red flags over time. And so that piece can be hard. And so it's, I think, putting together some of that history of seeking care at different places. And then, Kwami, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, but my thought is really just continuing to try to instill a trusting relationship so that at some point, hopefully a victim or survivor will feel comfortable kind of disclosing or talking to somebody. It might not be me personally, but hopefully some at some point along the care pathway.
No, and that's just right there. The more you see that person, the more you start to build a rapport with that person, the more you start to trust them. But with the traffickers now, what they do is they're so good at what they do. They are very smart. They make it very easy not to be noticeable. So if I was to be hurt and went to the same hospital multiple times, well, they're gonna know something's wrong. So what most traffickers, like my trafficker, did is that we don't go to the same physician twice. If we do, it's very rare actually. We don't really go twice. We see different person every time. We go to different part of the hospital to get treated. We go to emergency care or we go to whatever, just to avoid being seen or being questioned. So that's what he did, and that is mostly true for most victims, that the trafficker don't take you to the same hospital twice. And so it becomes very hard to identify if something's going on in the house or not.
Understood. Yeah, and to establish that connection with providers, I would imagine too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to our questions. And again, feel free, folks who are attending, to add questions to the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll see if we can get through them. A question about the frequency, and Michelle, maybe you can start this out, the frequency with which drugs and alcohol are involved in trafficking. I would imagine either on the victim side or on the trafficker side.
Sorry, I was muted. I don't have good statistics off the top of my head, but we'll tell you again that it's kind of a cycle, right? So an individual can be vulnerable to trafficking because of a substance use issue. And then substances can be used to kind of maintain that control over an individual. So they are not present in every trafficking situation, but definitely can be present throughout the trafficking kind of situation, again, in that pre-trafficking or kind of during that exploitation or compelled service. The other thing is that it can be something that that really does impact an individual long term. And so one of the other stories and survivors that worked with us on the website was a very different story from Kwami. She was someone that actually did experience domestic minor sex trafficking. Substances were used to kind of maintain control over her. And then she was arrested for substance use. That's something that kind of went on her record, as well as prostitution. But then that really does impact someone, again, thinking about the long term, right? So the ability to kind of exit that trafficking situation and move on with life can be marred by these for criminal reasons, right? So the human trafficking clinic, the law clinic at the University of Michigan, part of their goal is to help human trafficking survivors with any legal needs they might have. And I think that's actually a big portion of their work, is actually expunging some of these records so that people have the ability to get into different educational programs, jobs, different things that they want to after trafficking, where they have these records that were created by different forms of power and control, but in ways in which they are being controlled during the trafficking situation.
Thank you. Kwami, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, that's perfectly put together. I did see a question in here earlier, but so somebody asked, what was it about your counseling experience that was re-traumatizing, and what is the real disturbing about a child's perspective? Well, I can go ahead and answer that quickly if you don't mind. Is that okay if I answer that question?
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. Yeah, feel free.
Okay, so I remember exactly. So I don't remember where it is. I think it was somewhere on Carpenter Street. My counselor was there. I don't know why I remember that, but that's kind of weird. So somewhere on Carpenter Street, there's a counseling office there, and I'm not sure how I got there, how that played a role, but I just know I was there 2 times, and I never went back because my counselor, or whatever, who do we call them, she basically was kind of blaming me for what happened. It's like, why didn't you speak up earlier on, or why didn't you do this and that? And again, this is some language barrier too. So when I'm trying to explain to her what was going on, she's trying to fix me. Well, I was trying to tell her my story, what I went through. And so that itself was just like, okay, that's not right. First of all, you need to listen to me so I can explain to you what happened instead of you interjecting your thoughts or trying to tell me how I should have done things. That wasn't right. So after the second time, I decided this wasn't for me. So that's why I stopped going. And so we can't do that. That's not right. It doesn't matter if you have a language barrier or not. We should, counselors should not be, that shouldn't be the rule. They should be listening. They should take a moment to listen to the survivor fully, and then they can start to do more of their whatever they need to do instead of trying to fix that person. I didn't want to be fixed. I just want somebody to hear me. That's what I wanted, not to be fixed, because I wasn't broken. I just needed fixed. I just wanted to listen to me and tell me I'm loved, that everything's gonna be okay, instead of trying to fix me. So that's why I stopped going. it's more, but I don't want to get into that because then it would take forever. So just a little snippet of why I stopped going through that counseling after 2 days, after the second time.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Kwami. I mean, it's such a good reminder, I think, to all of us, right, who are providers, that the fundamentals, right, of helping, start with good listening. And sometimes I think we lose track of that, right, and want to jump in to try to solve a problem or to fix a situation when, when we should be kind of taking a step back and as you say, doing that careful listening. Michelle, did you want to add something to that?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess the listening is so important. And I will just say, in I guess both research and clinical experiences, I think we sometimes come in with our own agenda, what we think is most important to address. And that doesn't necessarily coincide with what the patient or client wants. And so again, just listening to them and focusing on their needs. In Ethiopia, we totally went in with this like health mindset, and everyone we spoke to there was focused on getting a job and job skills training, and could have cared, not that they could have cared less, but that was not their health needs were not their priority. And so I think Kwami did a good job just reinforcing that we just really need to listen to the individuals and what they are hoping to accomplish and get out of their care seeking experience.
So, given that we're on the topic, maybe we can kind of continue this for a second. I know that there was a question that somebody posted about, training school providers or people in healthcare settings to be more attuned to the needs of trafficking survivors, people who are in that situation. Anything? I know that you've talked about this already, but anything more you could say, Michelle, to that or on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is a standard part of any curriculum for educators or healthcare providers right now. So I would love to see that added. My experience with actually many topics related to different forms of gender-based or interpersonal violence is that it's added if there's a faculty member or somebody that has a special interest in it. And so I would love to see these topics just discussed more broadly and really thinking again about this trauma-informed and interdisciplinary care. So I think Kwami illustrated the need for the trauma-informed care and listening to the individual and prioritizing their needs. And then also really just thinking about how we can work together. So, in Kwami's story, he talked about interfacing with a few different systems, right? Healthcare system, social service system and school system. And was not recognized, did not receive what he needed from many of those systems. So really the importance of kind of working together as well.
Kwami, maybe I'll turn to you. A number of people have commented on your story and just your willingness to share all of what you have, which we are very grateful for. We really appreciate your willingness to do that. This question about, how do people overcome, the experience of being trafficked, the trauma of being trafficked? Of course, we know that that's kind of a lifelong process, right? And I wonder if you can speak any more to that issue for yourself, for others that the system let you down clearly, and you emphasize that. What have you done to sort of become the person you are, which is pretty remarkable?
Oh yeah, no, thank you. And I can take a credit for all of them because I have a team. It's a teamwork. I have to say, just the Human Trafficking Clinic there, and you have Bridget, which is her spirit, half of everything that's happening over there. She and her team they were wonderful to me from the beginning. To this day still, every time I have a problem, I call her. She's always there. If you know Bridget, she's awesome. She's amazing. So she's one of my my champions. Also, my foster care system. When I was placed in foster care, the people that I was with, they took me in as their own kid, and they just loved me and cherished me and listened to me and were able to help me to get the necessary paperwork that I need to stay in this country, because I didn't have the paperwork. I didn't have the credentials to stay here in this country, because everything I came here with was falsified. It was the wrong documents. So they were able to fight for me, knowing that like I couldn't do it by myself. So they fought for me from beginning until I was able to get that paperwork. I'm a U.S. citizen because of them. Like and Bridget, they all fought for me so I can get my citizenship. And I was able to go to school, even though Michigan wasn't allowed to help me go to school. I moved to Ohio so I can go to school, so I can get away from all the drama that I had in Michigan. So I got a bachelor's degree, and without the help of Michigan and help of any resources that were available for me, because that's the thing too. There are resources, but it's hard to use them. They make them impossible to use. I'm not sure why that is, but we need to make them easier so that we can get access to them. For like someone who like me want to go to school, I should be to apply for scholarship and get that and go to school. But when I was in Michigan, that wasn't the thing. They're like, no, you don't qualify for it, or if you move into a different state, you cannot bring that with you. You have to stay here to go to school here. Okay. Again, I'm here where I'm today because of the teamwork. People that where I surrounded myself with. My teacher that helped me, Bridget, and my foster care system, parents, and then my adopted parents, they all were part of my story. They all helped me to be where I am today. That's why I can take a credit for all of it. If I do that, I lie to you. I'm here because of all those people that I surround myself with, and also knowing that I can do it. I just have this mentality that I'm able to do it. Like I have to do this. This is the mentality that I have. Not only do I know the pain that I endure is still there, and it's a lifelong journey. I still have PTSD. I still think about my trafficker, even though he's in jail somewhere up north. I think in Saginaw. I don't remember. I think he's in Saginaw. There's a jail over there in Saginaw. He's there right now. I still think about him. He made my life miserable. But yet, with all that, I turned that into something good. It made me stronger. Why? Because I forgive him, and also I thank him for bringing me to this country so I can go to school. So there's so many facets to this story. I could go on and on about it, but at the end of the day, I'm here today because of those people who I surround myself with positivity, and they are willing to help me and listen to me, and give me the tools that I need so I can succeed in this life. So that's really my journey, and it's still a journey. I'm still going through it to this day. So when I get there, I'll let you know.
Well, but it's such an important, I think, message that you're underscoring, right? That it's not any one thing. I think Michelle made this point too, that it's a combination, right, of factors, both on the risk side and on the protective or resilient side. And Kwami, I think your story kind of illustrates that nicely, right? That you have these incredible strengths and assets, right, that you bring to a situation, but they can only be actualized when you're in the presence of people who help to support you and move your life in a positive direction. It's such I think, a good reminder to all of us, again, who are in the provider roles, to really think about, how to nurture, those kind of relationships and those individual qualities and all the things that we know to serve, the survivor as well, and build resilience. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Michelle, did you want to add to that?
I mean, well, you are extraordinary, Kwami. I would add that. And the other thing, I think he illustrates is how difficult it is to navigate resources. And so I'm really thinking about what's available to help you. And resources are a little different for someone who is a foreign national versus someone who, if you're somebody that lives in the United States, you're using the services that are already available, right? There's no kind of special services. But Kwami really did need legal support to navigate that process. And so obviously the law clinic, the law school's human trafficking clinic was really important. But I think resources are changing constantly. Housing for adult male trafficking survivors is like very difficult to find. I'm aware of one place in Michigan right now on the west side of the state. So thinking about finding these resources can be overwhelming from a system or provider perspective. And that's where I think, again, the working with teams, using the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because these services are changing frequently. And often you do need the expertise of lawyers or others that can help support each individual kind of victim survivor's needs.
Got it. That makes sense. All right, so I'll go ahead and ask one more question, Michelle. This is going to be directed to you. And Emma, if you're available to just take a look at the document, the Word document, to see if we've missed some questions there and maybe ask them after this one. So Michelle, somebody had asked about, this is kind of going back to the beginning again, but thinking about different contexts, different settings in which trafficking can occur, is it more likely, for example, that sex trafficking occurs in particular in remote areas versus those that are more populated or busy, or is there no way to really distinguish where this is going to happen?
I think it's happening everywhere, especially with online venues. Sex trafficking and labor trafficking are happening everywhere. I do think the type of labor trafficking depends a little on kind of the region, right? And what goods or services are most predominant there. But I don't think we have the ability to say this is happening more frequently in an urban or rural or a certain region at all.
Understood. So Emma, do you have a few questions you could read off?
I do. We actually have gotten a lot of questions. I'm going to ask one question to you, Michelle, and then Kwami, if you're comfortable answering a question about your trafficker, I'm going to move on to that one after. So Michelle, is the general term human trafficking used when referring to labor trafficking, or is it usually distinguished clearly the difference in the law enforcement industry?
Yeah, so I think of human trafficking as the umbrella, right? So that talks about compelled service. And then under human trafficking, there's sex trafficking, labor trafficking, organ trafficking, forced marriage. So labor trafficking in and of itself has that unique definition that I shared, that federal definition. And so it really talks about, recruiting, harboring, somehow getting somebody into involuntary servitude using force, fraud, or coercion.
Can I add something to that quickly?
Absolutely, Kwami.
Yeah. So the human trafficking is a term that most of the time people say human trafficking, they usually meant sex trafficking. And that's just across the board, really. Like, you don't really hear more of labor trafficking ever being mentioned. And so that's some of the reason why it is very crucial that we start to talk more about labor trafficking, because with sex trafficking is also involving labor, because when someone's body is being, you're basically getting money, so that's labor, and that person is not getting that money. So you can have sex trafficking without labor traffic, but you can have labor traffic without sex trafficking. Just wanted to make that distinguish right now, because sometimes we just don't think about it that way. We just say, oh, human trafficking, sex trafficking right away. Also, anyone who is being sex trafficked is also already being labor trafficked, because they are selling their body. Somebody's using them for their body to make money. That's labor. And so we got to do a better job when it comes to, I think of the word human trafficking is just a fancy term for slavery, really. That's what it is. It's just a fancy term for it. We don't want to use the word slavery, but that's what it is, really. Slavery. We are still experiencing that, just in different formats, online format, different facet of it. So we need to do a better job identifying or putting the right words to what we are talking about when it comes to this movement.
Thanks, Kwami.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. It's a really good point. So this next question is for you, Kwami, if you're comfortable talking about it. What happened to your trafficker? What actually ended up getting them prosecuted?
So he was tried twice, one at the federal level and then one at the state level. So he got, I think, at least 15 years in jail, and he is somewhere up north in Saginaw in jail there right now. Nice. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Oop, you just muted. There we go. Now you're good.
Sorry, my son is playing with my mouse. He is up north in Michigan, in a prison right there. I believe he's scheduled to get out soon, and I'm not sure when that is. I need to talk to Bridget about that. But that's where he is right now. I'm just part of me don't want him to come out because, you know, he will do what he did. He will do it again. I just know. So I hope and pray that he stayed there longer. So anyway, that's that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
What was it that, how were you saved?
Oh, my teachers. I was in 6th grade. So I went to school in the Ypsilanti. I went to the Lincoln district, so the Lincoln Consolidated. That's where I was at. So when I was in 6th grade, my teachers, 2 of my teachers that were there, they were the reason why I was able to be rescued, because they saw that I needed help and they saw that I was malnourished. I come to school with dirty clothes, smell like a rat dog or whatever that is. They step in and they said, this child needs help. And yeah, I needed help. So they took upon themselves to help me out. And that's what they did. And that's how I was saved, because they took the time to do the diligence beyond what they were asked to do as a teachers. And they helped me out day in, day out. They were calling people and calling lawyers and calling, you know, anyone they can call to tell them what's going on in my household, and and then they figured it out, and I was rescued in 2013. That was it.
And Kwami, that wasn't the first time your teachers tried to intervene, right? The first time.
No, that wasn't the first time. They tried multiple times.
And this was all in Washtenaw County.
Washtenaw County, yep. Yeah. Yep.
Which I have to say is really, I mean, I grew up in Saline. I drove by Lincoln Consolidated many times growing up.
Yep. I lived in a regular neighborhood, you know, kids and everything. I wasn't poor. Like we lived in a really good house, good, great neighborhood. Yeah, nobody knows what was going in that house. It was happening there. It was being trafficked, and nobody knows. Yeah. And we changed the house 3 times. Again, these traffickers are really good at what they do. We changed the house 3 times. That was with my trafficker. And it spent 6 years. We moved 3 times.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Kwami.
You're
getting quite a lot of praise in the chat.
Thank you.
We're really grateful to have you here. So this could really go to any of you. If you're able to get a survivor, or maybe not yet a survivor, alone, what questions can be asked that help determine if an individual is being trafficked?
That's a good question. So I think I focused a lot on the fact that we don't have good evidence-based questions, but the National Human Trafficking Hotline does have some questions that are available. I like to think of them as like a starting point for a conversation, as opposed to like a screening or diagnostic tool. So some of those are things like, you know, what type of, well, and this is more for adults too, right? So like thinking about what type of work that you're doing, thinking about living conditions. So are there locks on the doors or windows so that you can't get out? Asking about permission to do things. So like, do you need permission to eat, sleep, go to the bathroom? Depending on the age of the child, do they have control of like money or identification? If you are talking a little more about work, thinking about if they have control of their money or if they're being paid at all. As an adult example, there was a clinician that asked this question. They said, "Are you being paid?" And the adult answered, "Yes, I get $50 for 60 to 80 hours of work per week." And so again, these aren't yes, no questions. Like if that had been answered yes, that person actually would have said yes. But obviously $50 for 60 to 80 hours of work per week was not sufficient. And further kind of conversation did elicit that this individual was experiencing labor trafficking. So I think there are questions that we can use to start the conversation, just like we would with other forms of interpersonal violence, right?
Okay. I think this question might be to you, Michelle. Can you speak to some of your community engaged work specifically?
Yeah. So, I mean, by community engaged work, I mean working with the community in whatever I'm doing. So, some of my work is global, and I work on gender-based violence on university campuses. And so, we work with university students, administrators, faculty, and then also community members that would potentially be part of a response. So, like in the healthcare system, to really identify their major questions or concerns around that area, to design studies, and then to think about how to interpret and disseminate the results so that the questions aren't coming, from a top-down approach, that they aren't coming from a researcher, but they're kind of co-informed, co-managed, and then co-disseminated, so that they can impact the needs and then ultimately the work that is happening within that community.
So getting pretty close to the end of the time here. Emma, is there one other question you might ask before we wind up?
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure.
Emma, while you're doing that, I think I saw that somebody wanted the resource list shared.
Go ahead and
so I'm gonna go ahead and do that really quick.
That's perfect. Let's see.
I think someone was asking me earlier if my trafficker what was the presentation. Well, he was my father. He was presenting him as a father figure to me. That's what it was. It's just in case you're wondering.
Yeah, folks want to know a lot about your story, Kwami. There are a lot of questions coming through about that.
Oh, wait, yeah, I know. I saw that. It will be we need another like 2 more days or something. I don't know.
Okay, so let's see. To wrap things up, someone asked, our social service systems seem so overburdened and inaccessible. I know a couple programs in Michigan that are long-term living options for women and one for teens, but other programs for substance abuse treatment, financial assistance, housing, etc., are in such critical shortage. So I think what they're meaning is, if all of this is going on, how can we work to fix this problem?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that there definitely are limitations to our social services are overworked. There's limited space. And so just really investing more money, and again, thinking about prevention, right? And so there are some great services in the area. A lot of them focus specifically on sex trafficking. So I'm thinking like Alternatives for Girls, Vista Maria are in the kind of the Detroit and Dearborn area, but expanding that even more and thinking about prevention and early identification, I think are really important there to try to decrease some of that burden on our already overburdened social services.
Yeah, I just want to say this quickly. As I continue to be in this space, and one of the passion I have is starting a shelter for boys and males of a labor traffic survivor, because we don't have many of those around in Michigan or in Ohio. So, and across the country, we don't have any. So it's been a task of mine to start that kind of initiative right now, and I've been working on that to find a shelter to have a housing for boys and males of labor traffic survivors, so that we can start to help minimize some of those overburdened work for many of those service providers. Because as we know, as a male, I'm not going to walk into female-centric housing to ask for help. It just doesn't seem, me personally, I wouldn't do that, and I'm sure other traffic victims wouldn't do that, who are male, just walk into a female-centric housing and say, I need housing or I need service for any service. So my goal is to start one of those shelters where it would be mostly heavily focused on providing help for males and boys of labor traffic survivors. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there. That's something I'm working on right now.
It's fantastic. And we are at the end of our time. So just to thank you both. I mean, the work that you are both doing, is just absolutely amazing. And to echo one of the participants from today, I mean, it's just been so helpful. Michelle, you covered so much ground in such a short period of time. And I think that, the knowledge that you bring to this work is just impressive. And Kwami, what more can we say about your contribution, right, to the work in this area, that lived experience, bringing that forward, being willing to talk about these incredibly personal, but, important issues, I think, for providers to understand and for the general public to understand. So just really much appreciation to you both for being here today. And thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll hopefully continue this conversation. This is a topic that requires ongoing conversation. So this won't be the last time we'll touch on it. Thanks again.